All right, the first thing that I talk about with my students as part of this, material on writing basics is grammar. And grammar really is the infrastructure of language. When we're talking about grammar, we're talking about how the words in a sentence, work in their structure to create meaning in a sentence. And what I'd like to do is first talk about some of the vocabulary that we need to know to understand what we're talking about with grammar. So there are 8 different parts of a sentence. Some people call them parts of speech. And not every sentence has all of them, but any good sentence will have probably a lot of them. So the first part of speech is a subject. And the subject is the noun or pronoun that's doing the action. So what I like to do with my students is kind of write our own sentence where we kind of start to incorporate these different things as we go. So let's go ahead and get started with that in Microsoft Word here. And we'll just choose any subject we'd like. Usually I volunteer myself as the subject, so we'll go ahead and put that in there. Professor VandeWaa. Wish I could learn how to type today. So Professor VandeWaa, there we have a noun, which is again a person, place, or a thing. And we'll highlight that in a color so we can find it again later when we need to. So there is our subject, and that's the first thing that's required for a complete sentence. The second thing that's required for a complete sentence is the verb. And as you can see here, the verb is the action or state of being that the subject is doing. So when I talk about how my dog barks at other dogs, that is a verb, that's an action that the dog is doing. When I talk about how I drink coffee in the mornings, that's the action I'm doing. I'm drinking, okay? So let's go ahead and add a verb into our sentence here. A lot of times my students will come up with silly or scandalous verbs, but we'll go ahead and choose a pretty normal one here and say teaches. So Professor VandeWaa, what does he do? He teaches. And we'll highlight that in a different color so we can find it again later as well. Right here we have the 2 important things for a complete sentence, so we can finish our sentence with a period. We have a subject, Professor VandeWaa, and we have a verb that tells us what Professor VandeWaa is doing, or what he does, he teaches. So Professor VandeWaa teaches is a complete sentence. What we can also do, though, is add more to it and add more complex meaning, add more complex structure to this by adding in some of these other parts of speech. So let's take a look at a couple of these other things. Another part of speech, part of a sentence, is an object. And an object is something that's being acted upon in the sentence. So usually an object is whatever is receiving the action that the verb of the verb. So the subject will be doing something to an object. So let's go ahead and add an object into our sentence. If we take a look at this, we'll say who Professor VandeWaa teaches. Who does he teach? Professor VandeWaa teaches his students. Highlight that in a different color as well. But here we see that Professor VandeWaa, the subject, teaches, but who does he teach? He teaches his students. Who is receiving that teaching? Who's receiving that action? His students are. So his students are the object of the sentence here. We can also add descriptors and modifiers to the words in our sentence, and those frequently take the form of adjectives and adverbs. The difference between them is that adjectives only modify nouns. That's their only job. That's the only thing that they do. Adverbs, on the other hand, modify verbs, adjectives, or other adverbs. Frequently, and this is why I noted this in the presentation here, frequently adverbs end in ly. So when we say words like quickly, or slowly, or softly, those are all adverbs that would modify verbs, adjectives, or other adverbs. When I was in high school, I had an English teacher who used to sing this little song about adverbs, so I'll go ahead and sing that for you as well. An adverb modifies a verb, an adjective, or another adverb. An adverb tells where, what, or how, or to what extent. I'm not the best singer, but that song helps me remember the difference between adjectives and adverbs. And then adverbs only modify verbs, adjectives, or other adverbs. So let's go ahead and add 2 of these different parts of speech into our sentence as well by describing a couple of our nouns and verbs in the sentence. So we'll describe our students with an adjective. We have students, there it's a noun, so we're going to describe them using an adjective. And we will say that they are enthusiastic. which is always a good trait to have as a student, to be enthusiastic. So we will highlight that in different colors so we can remember it later. But that is an adjective because it describes a noun. So students, that's a noun, and the adjective description word there, enthusiastic, tells us more about those students. We can also add an adverb in there, and maybe we'll just add an adverb to describe how Professor VandeWaa teaches. So how does Professor VandeWaa teach? Maybe he quickly teaches, because maybe his class missed school because of a snow day, so they're trying to catch up. So Professor VandeWaa is quickly teaching his students. There's an adverb that again tells us more about the verb, and it also ends in ly. Not all adverbs end in ly, but most of them do, so that's a helpful hint. So now we have a more complex sentence that has, a little bit more complex structure, and we've added in some more parts of speech. There are a few more as well, so we can take a look at those and try and make our sentence even more exciting. One of them is a preposition. So prepositions link nouns to each other. It's a little bit vague, but I like to think of prepositions as anywhere a mouse can go. Again, this isn't a hard and fast rule, but it helps me to remember what kind of words prepositions are. So words like under, over, around, through, on, in, those are all prepositions. They're all, of course, places a mouse can go. And that's how prepositions link nouns to each other. If I say the mouse ran under the log, that tells us, the relationship between those two, nouns and how they work together and what relationship they had there. And so there are some other prepositions that refer to things like time. So words like after, before, during, those can all be prepositions as well. And then there's a couple of weird prepositions like the word of. The word of is a preposition. But we can go ahead and add in a preposition into our sentence to help us understand a little bit more how that works. And we'll add in a preposition that talks about time. So we'll say when Professor VandeWaa quickly teaches his enthusiastic students. So maybe he teaches them after they eat lunch. So our preposition word, the actual preposition, is the word after. So we'll highlight that in something like red here. And what comes after is, the whole thing together is a prepositional phrase. So that's a prepositional phrase, after they eat lunch. A quick tip for grammar that'll come in handy later on is that you'll never find the subject of a sentence in a prepositional phrase because prepositional phrases are dependent, they're subordinate, and so you'll never find the subject of a sentence in a prepositional phrase. Going back, we can add one more part of speech into our sentence here, and that would be a conjunction. A lot of us remember the old Schoolhouse Rock song, Conjunction Junction. And conjunctions join words, clauses, and sentences together. And they can add or subtract or combine things in different ways. A lot of you might remember the word fanboys. You might not remember what that means or signifies, but you might remember fanboys from one of your earlier English classes. Fanboys is an acronym for the coordinating conjunctions. So we can go ahead and write those out and try and remember them that way. F stands for, A stands for and, N stands for nor, B stands for but, O stands for or, Y stands for yet, and S stands for so. So you'll notice that each one of those, the first letters in those words spells out fanboys. So when you look down, it spells fanboys. And each one letter represents one of those coordinating conjunctions. And we're going to want to watch out for those coordinating conjunctions later on when we start doing punctuation and deciding what counts as a complete sentence and what doesn't, and when we need to add commas and when we don't. But we'll get to that in good time a little bit later on. So let's go ahead and add a conjunction to our sentence here. And we'll just add and, one of my favorite conjunctions. And, so here we'll highlight our conjunction in a different color so we can find it again later if we need to. And we'll go ahead and add a complete sentence afterwards. So whenever you use a coordinating conjunction with a complete sentence on either side, use a comma. But we'll talk about punctuation a little bit later on as well. So, and he loves it. So now we have a complete sentence, two complete sentences actually, that are joined with a conjunction. So this conjunction joins two sentences together. So now by the time we're all said and done, we've included a bunch of different parts of speech and made a pretty complex construction here. Professor VandeWaa quickly teaches his enthusiastic students after they eat lunch, and he loves it. True statement. Love to teach enthusiastic students. There's one more part of speech that we can't really smoothly integrate into our sentence here, but that's an interjection. And interjections are short exclamations. We like to think of those as any word you might say when you stub your toe. So you might stub your toe and say sugar jets. That hurt a lot. And so our interjection would be, a sort of short exclamation beginning of our sentence. We also use interjections to draw attention to things. So we might use a interjection to draw attention to things. When we use the word so it's time to go outside. So it's time to do our homework. Well, it's time to do our homework, right? Those are all short little interjections that draw attention to the sentence after it, okay? Once we understand and know what these different parts of a sentence are, then we can start to label and understand our sentences a little bit better. And so we used to do a lot of this when I was in elementary school and middle school. We used to diagram sentences every day, but not a lot of people do that anymore. I think it's a really helpful exercise and helps us understand the structure of a sentence and what role the different words in a sentence play. And I think it's important because it'll help us later on when we try and understand, well, when do we need to punctuate certain things and when don't we? So if you want to pause the video now, you can pause it for a second and try and identify these different parts of speech in this, this big sentence here. And I'll give you a quick second to do that. Otherwise, you can just stay tuned and we will go over the different parts of speech in the sentence. All right, so let's first identify the nouns, the persons, places, or things in this sentence. And our nouns are Professor VandeWaa, who also happens to be the subject of the sentence. Student is a noun. He happens to be the object of the sentence because he's receiving the action. He's being kicked down. And the classroom, that's a place, so that's a noun. We have the rest of his class is sort of a really big noun phrase there. And then we have a tricky noun at the bottom with manner. Manner is a thing and it's a noun as well. You might have thought he is a noun, but he is a pronoun. So we'll try and highlight this a little bit here. But he is a pronoun that takes the place of a noun. So he represents Professor VandeWaa. So he is the subject of the second independent clause here. So Professor VandeWaa kicked the other student out of the classroom, and then he, Professor VandeWaa, yelled loudly at the rest of his class in a very unpleasant manner. So he is one of the things that we haven't talked about. It's a pronoun. Okay, he, she, it, those are all pronouns. Now we're going to try and find our verbs. So what are our subjects doing? Well, there's only two verbs. We have kicked and we have yelled. So Professor VandeWaa kicked the other student out of the classroom, and then he yelled loudly at the rest of his class in a very unpleasant manner. Next, we'll try and find some adjectives. Remember that adjectives describe only nouns. So we'll take a look at those. We have unruly and unpleasant. So unruly tells us more about the student, and that means it's an adjective because it's describing a noun. You might have thought it was an adverb because it ends in ly, but not all adverbs end in ly. Only some of them do. Again, it's about the structure of the word and what it modifies and not about the spelling. And of course, unpleasant tells us more about the manner. What kind of manner was it? It was an unpleasant manner, so that adjective there describes that noun. Next, we'll find our adverbs. There's a couple of those as well. We have then and loudly. Both tell us more about yelled, so it tells us when he yelled and how he yelled. And then we also have very, which modifies the adjective unpleasant. It's a very unpleasant manner. It's not a very manner, right? That doesn't make much sense. It's a very unpleasant manner. So the adverb there is modifying the adjective unpleasant. And remember, of course, that adverbs modify verbs, adjectives, or other adverbs. Next, we'll try and find some prepositions. There's quite a few of them in here. We have out of, we have at, we have of, we have in. All of those are prepositions that add a little bit of detail to our sentence and tell us more about the relationship between things. Next, we'll look for conjunctions. There's only one of them. It's one of our fanboys. It's the word and. And here, the word and joins two sentences, just like it did in our example, and so we'd use a comma before it. But again, we'll get back to the punctuation, nitty-gritty stuff a little later on. We'll talk a little bit more about diagram sentences at the end of this presentation, but I think we'll take a quick break now because this seems like a pretty good time to stop. Next, we'll be talking about how and what rules we need to follow so that we can make sure that our grammar is correct and that we're using grammar to our advantage and showing the relationship between these different parts of speech in the best way and most correct way possible. So stay tuned, and we will talk about that next.